Denver Broncos starting the last AFC division here that we're talking about here today. 31.5 effective cap space, 16th most in the NFL, so right around the middle. Free agents, linebacker Cody Barton, DJ Jones, defensive lineman, running back Javonte Williams, linebacker Justin Chernod. Jaquan McMillian is also a free agent, but he's an exclusive rights free agent, so he's not going anywhere, effectively. That's kind of how that works. So really just the names that I mentioned before him. When you look at the Broncos, looking to take that next step, really played well this year with Bo Nix as a rookie. You're hoping that he takes that next step as well. Some team needs for Denver going in this offseason. What do you got?
I think it's just weaponry, right, on the offensive side. And Sean Payton's talked about this. He just needs more versatile weapons in his offense. I think at running back, at receiver, and at tight end, you feel good about Courtland Sutton being that reliable deep threat. And, Payton can always scheme things, and Bo Nix throws the short passes very well and sets up his receivers for success. But they need more talent at basically all of the weapon spots on their offense, right? So I think they're going to be looking at the draft at running backs, whether that be earlier in the middle rounds. That's going to be a big question. But again, another team with a lot of cap space who needs, especially at that intermediate level, they need some size. They need somebody who can work the middle of the field. They're going to be in on T. Higgins. I think, again, this is it's a huge story because there's so many teams where he would fit in, and Denver's one where he would fit in really, really well. So I think anywhere where they can get more weapons to support Bo Nix on offense is one. And then their one big weakness on defense was at linebacker. So I think that's a spot you could see them looking free agency for somebody like Robert Spillane. You could see them look maybe in rounds 2, 3, and 4 in the draft at some of the linebackers in this class. That's the one spot on defense where they do need to get better. The D-line was really good this year. The secondary was really good this year. Obviously, the defensive player of the year in Patrick Surtain. That's just the one place. If they fill out that linebacker spot, this could be an elite defense. But I think Sean Payton, and you kind of see it there with the guys that I picked for them as draft targets. Sean Payton a week or two ago talked about he needs jokers, right, in this offense. He needs guys who can create matchup problems and do a lot of different things. And some of those guys that I look at, as those draft targets, Colston Loveland, a tight end, yes, but somebody who can line up anywhere from inline to slot to outside and win, right? A guy like Emeka Ibuka from Ohio State at wide receiver who can motion all the formations throughout the formation and do different things for you. And then even later on, I have Quinshon Judkins down there. He's actually the least maybe versatile of that bunch, but he's certainly a reliable early down back, if not a 3-down back. And then a guy like Brashard Smith, who's a former wide receiver from Miami, maybe the best receiving back in this class. I think Sean Payton wants more versatility in this offense. It's something he's talked about. Find players like he used to have, say, with Alvin Kamara, with Jimmy Graham, with different guys he can move all over the formation and create those matchup problems for opposing defenses, because I think it's something he feels like Denver was missing this past year. And certainly with Bo Nix throwing the ball as accurately as he does, he can get the ball to those spots. They just need the players who are able to expand the playbook for him. YK in the chat's also saying this could be a potential Deebo Samuel landing spot. You've heard Deebo is sort of up there on the trade market as well from San Francisco if they're moving on from him, which I feel like they are this offseason. Denver's very interesting because then you get a situation where you've got Vele, you've got Marvin Mims Jr., you have Courtland Sutton. Now you're throwing in a Deebo Samuel. Then imagine if they're also able to draft a Courtland Sutton with that first round, Colston Loveland with that first round pick as well. Now you're talking about, wow, that is a diverse group of wide receivers. And then you can even wait a little bit more. You can still get, if that's the case, you can still get yourself a Quinshon Judkins, a Brashard Smith, something like that. So, man, there's a lot of possibilities here for the Denver Broncos. I like some of the free agent targets that you mentioned. I also like what YK is saying in the chat as well, getting a mismatch player like a Deebo Samuel to really put pressure on the defense. I like that for Denver. I'm not going to lie. I have not thought of that before, but I do like that for Denver. The Kansas City Chiefs, they're right around the cap floor. They are $3.6 million effective cap space over the cap, so in the red a little bit there, negative $3.6 million in effective cap space right now. Free agents, Trey Smith's the big one, Nick Bolton's the big one, DeAndre Hopkins as well. Justin Reed, I think, is an underrated free agent here on this team who, if they're not able to bring him back, I think it's a damn good football player. Josh Uche, Charles Omenihu, Justin Watson's a free agent as well, Juju Smith-Schuster, Kareem Hunt, DJ Humphries, who I know didn't work out for them, but it's worth noting because they don't have him on the roster anymore. Tershawn Wharton from the defensive line. Like, there are a handful of players here for the Chiefs that
okay, maybe not the Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce, Chris Jones type of stars for them, but definitely key role players. And you could make a case that, Trey Smith and Nick Bolton and Justin Reed, losing those three, any combination of them, would be a big blow to how complete that roster is and how well they have played over the last couple of seasons. So what about team needs here for the Kansas City Chiefs there as they bounce back from that Super Bowl loss?
So I think the obvious one is at left tackle, where they really didn't have an answer all year, and by the end of the year they were playing Joe Thuney, their left guard, out there at left tackle. And then right guard with Trey Smith, it sure seems like he's going to be maybe the highest paid offensive lineman this offseason in free agency. It doesn't seem like he's going to be able to stay. So those two spots on the offensive line are huge, and we saw that come up in the Super Bowl when Mahomes just wasn't protected enough, right? And they just couldn't stop that four-man rush from Philly. So pass protection, as it was the last time they lost the Super Bowl to Tampa Bay, it's going to be the big theme this offseason. They don't have to rebuild the whole offensive line like they did that time, but there's two big holes right now on their offensive line. I think they need more explosiveness at running back. I think this is the perfect draft class for them, maybe even on day 2. Go find an explosive player. Their running backs had the least amount of explosive runs in the league this year. Obviously, Isaiah Pacheco was hurt for a lot of it. They're playing Kareem Hunt. They're playing Samaje Perine. They just need somebody with some speed back there to me. I still like Pacheco. I still think he's got a big role on this team, but they need somebody. They've got tough runners. They need somebody who's blazing fast. I think somebody like Travion Henderson from Ohio State, who's got game-changing speed, could help them if they can get him in round 2 or 3. And I think the way I would go about this, I think Nick Bolton's a big guy to keep. Obviously they're not going to be able to keep Trey Smith and Nick Bolton. I think Bolton's more realistic, being that he's at a little bit less of a premium position, but he is the captain of their defense. And then I really think this is the team, if they can clear enough cap space, this is the one that needs to go and get Ronnie Stanley and try to pry him away from Baltimore. I think it would fix everything in pass protection that you need out of your left tackle. He was healthy this year. He had another great season. He's a fantastic pass protector. If they can do that, I think that then it frees them up from their first-round pick from having to take a tackle, maybe somebody like a Josh Connerly, who I mentioned, from the Ravens. So it could just be between the Ravens and Chiefs that one of them ends up with Ronnie Stanley and the other ends up with Josh Connerly. That's kind of the scenario I'm putting together in my head right now. But I think that would solve a lot, and then it would allow them in the draft to go, okay, we can find a right guard. We can find more run defense on the D-line. That's a big theme we've had today, and there's plenty of those in the draft. They could take a running back on day 2 without having to worry about what's in front of them. Say if it's a Travion Henderson, if it's a Caleb Johnson, even if it's earlier, if it's a Marion Hampton, something like that. I think it starts with the pass protection, though. The earlier they can fix that, and if Ronnie Stanley could be a primary target for them in even if that's like their only big free agent signing, you've done everything you've needed to do, because the one goal here now is to protect Patrick Mahomes. You still have weapons. Whether or not Travis Kelce retires is obviously a question, but Xavier Worthy came on in the second half of this year. Rashee Rice is going to be back. Andy Reid always finds ways to get people open, right? I think that's where it would start for me, is who is playing left tackle? I can find interior guys. I'll figure it out. But who's playing left tackle? Who's protecting that blind spot? Because that was really the biggest weakness this year.
No, I agree completely. It's just all about the offensive line for the Kansas City Chiefs. And you could tell Mahomes was not himself in that Super Bowl. And I think that it's because before the game even got kicked off, one of the very few times we've seen Mahomes mentally rattled in his career, and that was before the game even started. I think he watched the Eagles' defensive line on tape. I think he knows the limitations of his own offensive line, and he was rushing everything. He did not trust the guys up front to block for him the way that the way that he knew that they needed to in order to win that game. And because of that, the ball was coming out before it needed to. He was not seeing the field correctly, and he was Sam Darnold seeing ghosts at times. Even when there wasn't pressure, he was feeling like there was pressure, especially in that first half. It was one of the worst halves of football that we've seen from Mahomes in his career. So I think the offensive line, absolutely. I think the Ronnie Stanley call-out's a really good one. If he's going to be anywhere else, definitely could see it being with the Kansas City Chiefs. And if not, yeah, I mean, you're probably talking about an addition somewhere in the late first round. You mentioned Josh Connerly Jr. I'd even consider a guy like Gray Zabel from North Dakota State. At that point, it's just like, okay, well, I need good offensive linemen, because if you don't have either offensive tackle that you could depend on right now, if you think you're probably going to move on, you're not going to be able to bring back Trey Smith, well, then all of a sudden you got two good O linemen, right? All of a sudden, this offensive line for the Chiefs that we felt like was really, really strong, one of the best interiors in the NFL. Now you just got two out of the five, so you got to figure it out, and you got to look at a guy like Gray Zabel from North Dakota State, perhaps even a Donovan Jackson from Ohio State. You get a little bit further, an Ozzie Chapilo, who we talked about before, who I think could be a good option for them. Maybe a little bit later, and Anthony Belton, the Jalen Rivers. Seth McLaughlin, I know he's coming off injury, but he's playing well for Ohio State before he got injured. Somebody like that. I think offensive line is the big-time priority. And then the last thing I'll shout out before we move on, I like the guy that you had in your notes of Calais Campbell as well. If Campbell's going to stick around and he's not going to retire, doesn't feel like Miami can re-sign him. If he wants to go ring chasing, he'd go to Kansas City, and I think that he'd be a welcome addition there for how well he is still playing at an old age and how smart he is along that defensive line, which they love. Las Vegas, anybody would love, to be honest with you. But Las Vegas Raiders are the next team. $85.7 million in effective cap space. That is second most in the NFL, behind only the New England Patriots. Now, they've got a handful of free agents here. Not backbreaking ones, but ones that could definitely set what their team needs are going to be when we get to draft weekend. I think the two that really stand out to me, Trayvon Merrick, Isaiah Polamalu at the safety spot. If you're bringing back one of or none of those guys, then safety all of a sudden becomes a major priority for you. Corner already is, in my opinion, a major priority for them. You also have Nate Hobbs, who is a free agent too, so you have to think about that as well. Robert Spillane, who is a big standout player for them. Divine Diablo, who we were really excited about before he got hurt at the beginning of the year. A couple of other guys, Alexander Madison, Darnay Holmes, Kayvon Chason, John Jenkins, Jordan Meredith along the offensive line, but he's an exclusive rights free agent, so he's not going anywhere. But Dalton, what do you think about this team? Where's the team needs here for you for the Las Vegas Raiders?
Yeah, there's a ton of them, right? They were dead last in the league in coverage grade. I think it was the worst team coverage grade anybody's had in like 4 or 5 years. That's a spot where I look at in free agency and I go, if there's a team that's going to get to, I think, the top of the secondary market, I think a DJ Reed, corner from the Jets, Javon Holland, safety from Miami, I think that's where it might start. I think about Holland, and they already swiped one Miami Dolphin last year, right? And Christian Wilkins up front. Now you get one on the back end. I think that's where the base has to start for Patrick Graham and this secondary is, look, we have to substantially improve the talent base, right? And I know, again, losing Trayvon Merrick wouldn't help. They could even re-sign him and sign another safety and sign multiple pieces in the secondary, but that would help them raise the floor on their defense a lot, because we know when Max Crosby's healthy, they can rush the passer, right? They've got him. They've got Christian Wilkins if he's healthy. We'll see maybe if Malcolm Kuntz is also a free agent. He didn't play it all this year, but he was really coming on in the second half of 2023 and helped them a lot. So I think the back end of that defense for Pete Carroll is going to be a big focus. And then you look on the offensive side of the ball, you have a decent offensive line. You've got Brock Bowers, you got Jacoby Myers, but they need help both at quarterback and at running back, especially. They had the worst rushing grade in the league last year too. So that's a spot where I start thinking about getting into some theories about that 6th pick in the draft and maybe go, is this the team that ponies up early and takes, say, an Ashton Ginty from Boise State, maybe a potential generational kind of running back prospect that behind a good offensive line, you base this thing around the run game and defense, and if you're going to figure out your franchise quarterback later, if they're going to sign Russell Wilson or Sam Darnold or something like that, this is another team, depending on the move they make at quarterback in free agency, we could know their intentions come draft time too. I think this is another one where you think about if they feel highly enough about a Shedeur Sanders or a Cam Ward. Could they move up to 2? Could they sit at 6 and wait for one of them to drop and wait for those draft night decisions? There's really going to be a lot about this quarterback situation that's shrouded in mystery for the next couple of months. But I think you're talking about top targets too. You think about Ashton Ginty at running back, even a Tedero McMillan at wide receiver to give him kind of that X guy that complements Jacoby Myers. They have a lot of options here. But I do think improving the coverage, improving the secondary is going to be high on the list for Pete Carroll and Patrick Graham, and then the offense is going to fill out as we get closer to the draft.
Yeah, Pete Carroll knows how to build out a secondary too, so we know that we don't have to worry too much about that. It'll probably be a little bit more of a couple of year vision there for them. By the way, I talked about Divine Diablo. I meant Malcolm Kuntz, when I talked about a guy that they were excited about who got hurt, who we didn't really get to see this year. Although Diablo also played well as a pass rusher this past season. But if you're moving on from him, sort of that hybrid player, I like the Nicky Manwari call out there as a safety who could play at the second level. There's a couple of linebackers that they could go with. I do agree with Walt in the chat. Feels like they're going to bring back Robert Spillane, especially for as much money as they have in effective cap space. So feel like they're going to bring him back. You feel like the heart and soul of that defense there in the middle. So I don't think that they really want to lose a player like that. I feel like Mary is another player that they don't really want to lose. But you mentioned, depending on what happens with those safeties, that really tells you how desperate they're going to be when it comes to draft time. So yeah, some safeties, some corners. I think we consistently look at the cornerback position. If the Raiders aren't drafting a quarterback at number 6, it feels like they're probably going with Malachi Starks, Will Johnson, somebody like that. I mean, I guess you could trade down from number 6 as well if you don't love either of those defensive players, get some extra draft picks, pick another corner or a secondary player probably somewhere else in the first round. But that's where I go for this team. Not that it's a complete team yet, but the secondary, you mentioned how bad it was, one of the worst season grades that we've ever given out here at PFF as a team. And so that just has to be so much better this upcoming season. So whether it's making a big splash with a guy like DJ Reed or Javon Holland, or maybe even double dipping. Maybe you're getting DJ Reed and you're signing Will Johnson, or you're drafting Will Johnson. You could absolutely be doing that because it was that poor last year for the Raiders. But those are some of the initial needs as well. Running back, you'll have plenty of time. Now, this is one of the least dynamic running back rooms in the league last year. You'll have plenty of time to get the running back that you need for this team. I think you've got to set up a little bit more of the priority positions before you prioritize getting that dynamic back. That will be more of a complementary piece, in my opinion, over the next maybe 1 or 2 off seasons here for this team, as you got to have to look at it as a little bit more of a long-term project since you made so many changes at general manager with John Spikek coming in there, and obviously with Pete Carroll coming out of retirement as a head coach, but technically didn't retire. He just wasn't a head coach last year. So back under the head coach headset, I should say, for the Raiders, which I am very excited about. Last team that we're talking about is the Los Angeles Chargers. $55.1 million in effective cap space. That's the 6th most in the NFL. Although I will say, if they were to cut Joey Bosa, they get 25 more million on top of that. So that number then would go all the way up to 80, which I think would make them the third highest. Yeah, now that's obviously independent of other teams making other moves, but that would jump them all the way up from 6th most effective cap space to the 3rd most effective cap space in the NFL. But they have a couple of guys that they got to make some decisions on too. Khalil Mack, Poona Ford, J.K. Dobbins, Elijah Molden, Morgan Fox, and then you get some other players, Christian Fulton, Josh Palmer, Denzel Perryman. Bradley Bozeman's a guy who played almost every snap for them last year along the offensive line. Tier Tart as well along the interior defensive line. So you can bring back a handful of those guys, certainly with as much money as they have, including if they free up some more by moving on from Joey Bosa. But if they move on from Joey Bosa, well, then it feels like edge rusher becomes a massive need for them, even with Tuli Tuipulotu on the team. But edge rusher, I just talked about sort of as one need. What are some other needs here for the Los Angeles Chargers this offseason? Yeah,
I think the defensive line is going to be a big focus, especially in free agency with all those guys you mentioned, especially Mack and Ford, both of whom just had spectacular years last year, Taylor Tart too. But they need more weapons aside from Ladd McConkey as well. I think they like where their offensive line is at. Yeah, obviously like having Justin Herbert at quarterback. They just need other productive players. I don't know if they'll bring back Josh Palmer, but even then, that's not a significant improvement on anything they have. Quentin Johnston really hasn't panned out for them the first 2 years, and they got almost nothing out of the tight ends this past year. You know, they were starting Will Dissly, who's not really a dynamic receiving threat. So I think finding more receiving threats, and even players in the backfield. You mentioned Dobbins as a free agent. As the year went on, though, they didn't run the football all that well, and I just think they need something. They need a horseback there, right? And I know they squeezed something out of Dobbins. Gus Edwards was okay for him because he's familiar with Greg Roman and the system and all that. But I think they're another team. I think on day 2 more likely than their first round pick, unless Ashton Ginty were sitting there for any reason. Then I would really think about it. I think on day 2 you're going to see them take a starting caliber running back and really reset this backfield as well.
Who's the back that makes the most sense for this team you like? I see you wrote down Cam Scatabo. I feel like Jim Harbaugh would have a blast with Cam Scatabo if he was his back. Is that your favorite target here for the Chargers?
Yeah, I mean, aside from if something crazy were to happen and Ashton Ginty were to fall, I believe, all the way to 22, that's the obvious one for anybody. But no, Scatabo, the more I looked at it, and part of it I looked into also was the Chargers are kind of a heavy power and gap scheme kind of team, and Scatabo is really the next best back behind Ginty in that category this year. And he's a very underrated receiver. You know, he's thought of as this power back breaking all these tackles, but he's an underrated receiver who can really give you a two-way threat. And you mentioned it. Just feels like Jim Harbaugh's kind of guy, right? Just get out there and run the ball like an absolute psycho. I think Scatterbo, if they were to get him in the second round along with maybe, say a Colson Loveland, a tight end who Harbaugh's familiar with in the first round, or a Luther Burden or a Matt Golden to help them out at receiver. I think that's just the idea as you start filling out this offense, especially as well as Justin Herbert played this year, really with Ladd McConkey as his only legitimate receiver on the outside. There's real potential for this offense to be incredibly dynamic next year if they pick up the right players and they fill in around McConkey, right, and they can continue to work McConkey all over the formation with all the things he can do inside and outside. So I think this is a team I go into this offseason looking at with a boatload of potential, but I think the first step is going to be figuring out what this defensive line looks like in free agency. Again, Khalil Mack, Poona Ford, Taylor Tart, these were massive contributors this past year, and if you want to continue to supplement the defensive line in the draft, which Jim Harbaugh is going to do, he's always reinforcing the trenches, getting more depth guys. But I think coming into free agency, that's going to be a story. And again, when you have the money and you need a weapon, T. Higgins is at least going to be a thought. And could you imagine him with Justin Herbert and Ladd McConkey in this offense? And then you go into the draft thinking about Loveland and the running backs and everything that goes around that.
That'd be a lot of fun. I think the Chargers are one of the most fun teams that you could really take a look at this offseason, and they're sort of a ball of clay with all the money that they potentially have, some of the guys in and out of that lineup. You could really change this team and really slingshot this team, which already, I think, played better than expectations for most people last year. And I think everybody looked at the Jim Harbaugh signing. They were like, okay, it's only a matter of time before the Chargers are back on top. And for them to make the playoffs this year, it was really fun to see. And they've got an opportunity to continue to build off of that in a major way. This is a team that does have 11 draft picks. So they could also be a team to move up from number 22, if a top-tier wide receiver, if they don't get a T. Higgins or somebody like that, if a Tetron McMillan is fallen, if a Luther Burden is fallen and they really want a guy like that, they might be able to pop up a couple of spots there. A couple of people in the chat are asking about Amari and Hampton, because I think Hampton would be a fun fit for this team as well, but for how good of a back he is. Somebody asked, will he be available in the second round? Chargers currently pick at 55 in the second round. I don't know if he makes it to 55. But again, you could pop up from 55, somewhere in the late 30s, early 40s if Omari and Hampton is still there with one of those picks. Because they have 11 picks, but it's one first-round pick, one second round, one third round, one fourth round, two fifth rounds, 3 sixth rounds, and then 2 seventh rounds. So it's 11 picks, but it's not like it's a ton within the top 100. That's normally how it works. You get more of those picks there a little bit later in the draft with those 3 comp picks that they have. Certainly helps bolster that up to double digits. So the Chargers are going to be a fun team to watch, especially if they move on from Joey Bosa. And then you sort of get into a Joey Bosa saga of, okay, any of the teams that we talked about earlier here in the show, would they be interested in bringing in a veteran like Joey Bosa and taking a chance on him, even though doesn't feel like the same player that he was a couple of years ago. Feels like the injuries are kind of catching up to him. But maybe a new home, somebody that can use him very well. He becomes, I think, a free agent that you got a note of depending on what happens with the Chargers. Thanks for watching, everybody. Make sure you like and subscribe the video. And if you don't have a PFF Plus subscription, you can get one to see all the premium stats that we talked about here on the show, plus the expert betting and fantasy advice over at subscribe.pff.com. The description is also right below, so if you are not a PFF Plus subscriber, you can come one today.